Well, he's one of the most colourful and controversial public figures of our time. Brilliant, intellectual, Oxford-educated, an orator. But he's also wildly funny and entertaining. Former British PM Boris Johnson rose to fame globally, backing Brexit, but his time in office was often controversial. He'll open up about all of this when he visits Sydney and Melbourne in December, and I spoke with him ahead of his Australian tour a little earlier today. Boris Johnson, so great to see you. Thank you for your time.
It's an absolute pleasure to be with you.
Look, it's less than a week to go until the US election. Donald Trump famously asked Theresa May in front of the cameras why you weren't Prime Minister at the time. Would you like to see Donald Trump return to the presidency?
Well, listen, it's very, very sweet of you to have me on your show. It's wonderful to be here. But as I explain in my book, Unleashed, which I will be relentlessly plugging when I get over to Australia in the early part of December, the job of the UK Prime Minister is to be friendly with whoever is the President of the United States. But you will also discover in Unleashed some paradoxical and interesting things about what Donald Trump was like to work with, and it kind of goes against a lot of the negative stuff that you sometimes hear about Donald Trump, because my experience of him as Foreign Secretary, when I was Foreign Secretary, and then when I was Prime Minister, was actually he did some stuff that was bold and decisive, and that really made the world feels safer. And a couple of things I'll cite, and they're all in the book. But the way he punished Bashar al-Assad for using chemical weapons against his own people, the way he was really tough with Iran, with Qasem Soleimani, the head of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Quds Force. Remember, he more or less vaporized the guy. There was only his signet ring left. And then, people talk a lot about Donald Trump. And is he going to be soft on Putin? Has he got this kind of strange thing that's going on in the Republican Party, where they kind of have a fanboy, thing about Putin, which I personally don't share at all. I don't think so. And you look at what Trump actually did on the Russian file when he was president from 2016 to 2020. The two things I would single out that were incredibly important. He decided, after we had the terrible poisonings in Salisbury, Trump massively surprised on the upside. And the United States expelled 60 Russian diplomats, which was the biggest expulsion since bigger than any, I think, that had happened even in the Cold War. And that was Donald Trump who did that, kicked out Putin's spies. And number two, a lot of people talk about Trump and Ukraine. Is he going to be solid? What's going to happen? I just remind you what he actually did when he was president. Unlike, and it's all in Unleashed, you will read it, and I'll be talking about it on BorisUnleashed.com when I get to Australia. What he actually did was to give the Ukrainians lethal weaponry, which the Democrats had not done when they were in office. And Donald Trump actually gave the Ukrainians the shoulder-launched Javelin anti-tank weapons, which were so important in that battle for Kiev in the spring of 2022. So all I can say, people endlessly, it's not the job of UK prime ministers to get involved in, or UK politicians to get involved in American elections any more than we would get involved in Australian elections. It's just, we're great, friendly democracies. It's not how we do things. But I would just say, chapter and verse in here, there's some pretty surprising and paradoxical things about, what people say about Trump and what he actually did when he was in office. And I'm content and I'm optimistic to judge him on the basis of what he did. That doesn't mean that, I didn't have a very high regard for Joe Biden as well, and had a good relationship with Kamala Harris. And Biden's been very strong on Ukraine in particular. But, look at the record.
Boris, do you think there's been an unfair campaign to try put Donald Trump in jail so that he can't be president again?
I think it was look. I mean, the various legal cases have wound their weary way before the courts, and my impression of them is that they were essentially trying to deprive the people of the opportunity of voting on Donald Trump. And it was a kind of lawfare designed to take out a candidate. And again, shoot me if you think this is too optimistic. But they were trying to take out a candidate that a lot of people don't like, they don't like his style, don't like the things he does, the things he says, and I kind of get all that, but I think it backfired, and whatever I disagreed very much with what happened on January the 6th. That was absolutely terrible. On the other hand, look at what is happening now, and as we talk, we're only days away from an election in the United States where Donald Trump is out competing for every vote that he can get. He's trying to win another term of office, as is Kamala Harris trying to win the presidency. And they're both trying, by purely democratic means, to secure popular support. And here's the incredible thing. We don't know. Neither of us knows. Nobody knows. And not even, I'm here in New York, but nobody knows who is going to win that election. Now, that is a fantastic thing, because there are countries, big and important countries in this world, powerful countries, where that is not true, where the outcome of so-called democratic elections are well known in advance. Look at Russia. Look at China.
You were with the Queen 2 days before she sadly passed away. You saw the Queen for an hour most weeks. You talk in the book about pouring your heart out. You describe it as free psychotherapy. What was the best advice she ever gave you?
The convention is, of course, that you can't really talk about a lot of the conversations you have with the Queen. You certainly can't talk about any political conversations that you have with her. But I think, without breaking my Privy Council oath, I can say what she said in her last conversation with me, which was 2 days before she died. And she was absolutely brilliant. She maintained her total grip on world affairs, and she'd seen every U.S. prime minister since Eisenhower. U.S. president since Eisenhower. She'd met every French president from Charles de Gaulle to Macron, every Chinese leader since Mao, and she knew everything. And what did she say? She said a great thing in life is not to be bitter, because in the last conversation I was sort of saying, well, because one of the reasons I'm giving this interview to you now is I was untimely removed from my job, and one of the points I make in Unleashed is a great shame, because I think we would have won the 2024 election if that hadn't happened. But she was saying to me, well, it's very important in life not to be bitter. And she was saying that it was good that I didn't seem to be at all bitter, and I wasn't, and I'm not. So she said, don't be bitter. Point number one, good advice to all politicians: don't be bitter. Don't be actuated by bitterness. But she also said something quite interesting. I don't know do you have a phobia of magpies in Australia? Does anybody have a phobia? Do you have a phobia of magpies?
Magpie season in September, and they do swoop, and you see cyclists, particularly in the national capital, Canberra, cycling around with, buckets and funny things on their head to avoid the swooping magpies. Yes.
Really? Okay, well, so there's a saying in England: 1 for sorrow, 2 for joy, 3 for a girl, 4 for a boy, right? Yeah. So if you see a single magpie, it's bad luck. And there are lots of people who I know who have this phobia of single magpies. And I mentioned this to Her late Majesty the Queen, and she said she had exactly the same thing. But she had a cure for it. She had a spell. She had a way of dealing with it. And it was when she saw a solitary magpie, she would say, "Good morning, Mr. Magpie. Today is the 30th of October, 2024, or whatever it is today. Is it? I think it is the 30th of October, 2024. And that does it. And then your single magpie problem is gone."
The magpie conversation came up in your final ever conversation with the Queen 2 days before she passed away. Boris Johnson, you are quite hilarious. I understand that the royal family tried to get you personally to persuade Prince Harry to stay in the UK and not move to the United States. They asked you to give him a manly pep talk. How did that go down?
I honestly can't remember the genesis of this idea, and I think it may have been my own sheer pomposity that made me think that I could persuade, because I like Harry and I like Meghan too. And when I was Foreign Secretary, I did a great event with them about educating young women and girls around the world, because there's a catastrophe of the disparity between male and female education in some countries is appalling, and would fix so many problems in the world if you could fix that. Anyway, Harry and Meghan came and they were brilliant, and I tried to persuade him not to go to California, and it was pathetic. I wouldn't. I failed to avert Megxit. But I did deliver Brexit, and I'm very proud of that. And if you want to discover why Brexit worked, and I know it's still controversial, lots of people object, but if you want to discover why Brexit worked, read Unleashed, and please come to some of the BorisUnleashed.com events that are taking place in Australia in early December.
I want to cover a few areas. So I just want to take you to the setting up of AUKUS, a very important initiative that's to your credit and to Scott Morrison's. Before your meeting with Joe Biden to get him over the line on AUKUS, you and Scott Morrison made the decision not to tell Emmanuel Macron about it. You didn't trust him?
Well, it wasn't quite like that. The trouble was, if you remember, everybody, I hope in Australia knows this, the background of this. This is a very important initiative because, from my point of view, it was a way that the UK and the United States could support Australia and to build a coalition of freedom-loving democracies that share our values and trust each other so implicitly and so intimately that we're willing to share very, very secret details of nuclear technology and other technologies. And that's what AUKUS is all about. It's all about the submarines. And so the problem was, as everybody knows, that the deal had been done between Australia and the French, for the French to supply some diesel submarines, and these were frankly too noisy. They weren't suitable for Australia's purposes, and they needed some vessels, some boats that were quieter, and they wanted nuclear propulsion. They came to us, and look, I mean, in order to give the technology to Australia, the UK clearly had to get the acquiescence of the United States, because the technology ultimately comes from the US, and the US is very vigilant in guarding those secrets. And so before we could go ahead and do the AUKUS deal, and before Australia could let Emmanuel Macron down, we had to make sure that we had our ducks in a row. We had to make sure that the Joe Biden, the President of the United States, was willing to share that technology, not just with the UK, but also with Australia. So that, you're quite right, that meant there was a period in which we were very worried that the deal would get out and Emmanuel would be furious, and a lot of paint would come off the plaster would come off the ceiling in the Élysée Palace, and he would jeter ses jouets dehors de la poussette, as we say in French, and manger le tapis. And so there was as I say, I should have mentioned it, as I say in this book Unleashed, there was a period.
Well, you were worried he'd try and kill off the deal before it was done. That's what you say in the book, and that he didn't like your dog either, Emmanuel Macron.
Well, I don't know. My dog unfortunately barked during a moment of sort of Anglo-French solemn ceremony. I offered Emmanuel my dog to hold, but he mysteriously declined the honor of holding Dylan. But look, I mean, I don't want to trivialize this. The relationships between France and the UK, as with France and with the UK and Australia, are incredibly strong. And actually, there were many, many things where Emmanuel and I agreed. But the problem with AUKUS was it was really, it was for Scott. It was for Australia to let Emmanuel down. It wasn't my secret to share with him, as it were. It was something that Australia, needed to sort out. But I couldn't see any other way of organising it. So we had a slightly peculiar summit.
Boris Johnson, you were widely loved. You had wide popular support in Britain after Brexit. But during the COVID pandemic, you were widely criticised, not just for Partygate. If you had your time again, would you still have the full lockdowns, the bans on children going to schools, even playground, and the vaccine mandates?
It's such a brilliant question. And I guess everybody in Australia we all ask ourselves that now. But, and a lot of people now, with hindsight, say your lockdown was wrong. I go through a lot of the arguments, and I try to look at the evidence in Unleashed and to discuss it all. But you've really got to ask yourself, what would we do if we had another one? And we will get another one. And what would we do if this time the most vulnerable people weren't people who were in their 80s, but what if it was school kids? What would we really do to try to stop transmission? And it is incredibly difficult. I think that it's very easy to say that lockdown was overdone and a mistake and that we should have done something else, but that is not how it felt at the time. But what I am particularly proud of, and really Brexit did help deliver this, is that the UK had the fastest vaccine rollout of any European country. And that was at least partly, largely because we had come out of the European Union's institutions and we licensed those vaccines, AstraZeneca, Pfizer, the rest of them, 4 or 5 weeks, maybe more, before the 27 EU countries. And so that meant that by March 2021, we were way out in front. And indeed, as you will discover in this book, it was the cause of considerable frustration on the part of our European friends. But there are many things I would do differently, but I think that vaccine rollout was certainly one of the things I'm proudest of. And no doubt at all, Brexit, for all its critics, Brexit helped deliver it. Brexit, my friends, saved lives, and people may dispute that, but read this book and you'll see why.
You went to Israel after October 7 with Scott Morrison in a solidarity visit. In London, we saw tens of thousands of people take to the streets, pro-Palestinian marches that began before Israel's response had even started. There's been violence and aggression on the streets. Boris, what's gone wrong here? Is this partly an immigration failure, as some have suggested?
No, look, it's a terrible thing, which is that I was very proud to go with Scott to Israel to see what had happened. And look, the trouble is that in all our societies, whether it's Australia, whether it's the UK, whether it's the United States of America, there is a virus of anti-Semitism, the spores of which lurk beneath the floorboards, and it comes out. And, remember what happened on October the 7th. 1,200 people were massacred, tortured in appalling, innocent Jewish people. And what I find amazing now is that people can't focus on the reality that Israel is legitimately trying to prevent that type of massacre from happening again. And the people that did it, whether Hamas or others, they want to eradicate Israel entirely, and not just Israel, but every Jewish person in the world. And frankly, any democratic leader is entitled to try to protect his or her country from that sort of madness. And so, yeah, look, I'm firmly with Israel in their right to self-protection. And, I wish everybody had a bit more moral clarity about this. And I agree with you completely. It was weird to see demonstrations the day after that massacre, effectively in favor of Hamas.
It's been absolutely terrible the world over, including in Australia, as you'll see when you get here in a couple of months' time. Look, Boris Johnson, we've covered a lot of ground, wars, foreign policy, politics. I want to ask you a final personal question, though. There is a great mystery about you, something so simple. How many children do you have?
I tell you, it's 8. It's 8 so far. Yeah.
So
8.
far, so there still might be others on the horizon.
I didn't say that. It's just 8. 8. Which, you know, what I would say about that is, I'm being wrapped up. My handlers are telling me I've got to shut up. But I'll tell you, we do face a demographic deficit in the UK and many other Western countries as well. So I feel that in spite of the carbon footprint that I'm undoubtedly generating, I think it's a perfectly defensible thing to do.
Boris Johnson, thank you very much for your time. Great to speak with you.
Real pleasure. Lovely to talk to you. Thank you very much, and look forward to seeing you in a few weeks' time.
And as Boris Johnson just mentioned, he'll be in Australia shortly. If you want to see more of him, head to borisunleashed.com. You can book tickets for his Sydney event on Friday, the 6th of December, and in Melbourne on Saturday, the 7th of December. That's at borisunleashed.com. I like that line about a demographic deficit.